This video is on Chapter 8, Making Disciples, from our Management for Church Leaders, Volume Number 1 Training Manual. Now, this chapter is one of the most important chapters in the book, and it's my favorite because it's dealing with the main priority of the church, which is about making disciples. Everything the church does, everything a leader does, should be focused on making disciples. We use the scripture from Matthew 28:19, where Jesus said to go therefore and make disciples. That's the reason the church exists. That's why we exist as leaders within this ministry. So before you begin teaching this chapter, look at the instructions at the beginning of the chapter. Make sure you understand the goals and the key points that we want to emphasize in this chapter. Then we begin this chapter by always asking a question. And that question is about the difference between teaching and discipling. So what I'm trying to do here is have the participants start thinking about the difference between teaching and discipling and understanding what that difference is before you proceed to talk about discipleship. Now we're going to get into talking about why discipleship is important. And one of the things I like to do before we begin this section is have the participants gather in groups of 3 or 4 and discuss the question about why discipleship is important, to kind of, again, get them thinking about this topic. Then we go through several reasons why discipleship is important for the church. And one of the things that I like to talk about is that often the church is looked at as a sanctuary or a place where we come and just worship and be together, but it's more than that. I really think that the church should be like a training center where we go and we train and equip God's people to go out and do ministry and to be His witnesses. So that's one of the emphasis I want to make in this particular section of the manual. Now we move on to talking about the principles of discipleship. And there are 6 principles in here, and they all revolve around giving time and effort and the fact that discipleship is a process. So I want you to spend a little bit more time in this section of this particular chapter to make sure that we get these points across. We cannot emphasize enough the importance of discipleship to the church, so understanding these principles will really help the participants get a good grasp on discipleship. Now that we've talked about the purpose of discipleship and the principles of discipleship, we want to talk about the process. And the first thing we do is we want to talk about what discipleship is and how do you know what discipleship is. So in this next section, we talk about the 6 signs of discipleship. Now, only God knows a person's heart, but we can at least observe from behavior some activities and some things that people are doing to give us an indication of whether or not they're a follower of Jesus or not. So we talk about things like their faith and whether they attend worship, are they involved in Bible study and prayer, do they serve the church, are they involved in mission and witness. And this section is just to give us an idea of what we expect a disciple to look like when we complete the process of discipleship. The last thing we want to talk about in this chapter is formulating a discipleship plan. And I usually begin by asking the attendees how many of them have a plan for discipleship for the church. Because this is important. If it is the goal of the church, then we should have a plan for how we're going to do it. And sadly, a lot of pastors and leaders do not have a plan for discipleship. So what we want to do is talking about having a plan, how to formulate a plan. I also talk about the fact that there is no one simple solution for everybody because discipleship is a process. But you need to understand the process. And so we give 6 steps here how to work people through the process of discipleship so that they get connected to the church, they get connected to their faith, and they begin to understand what it means to grow as a disciple. And then finally, we want to talk about ongoing evaluation, that if you have a plan, you need to sit down every year and evaluate that plan. You need to ask yourself questions about whether this discipleship process is working. Are people growing in their faith? Are you seeing the fruit that is being born because people are becoming disciples? And those are some of the things that you should begin to see. And you need to do that evaluation every year to make sure that your plans are on track and that you can make adjustments as you get ready for the upcoming year of discipleship. The exercise at the end of this chapter is, again, another exercise where you can get the participants to think about how they might organize a discipleship process. When we talk about these different categories of believers, that there is a new believer and then they become a basic believer, and then as they grow, they become more stable in their faith, and eventually they become a strong believer. But by taking the people and putting them into these categories, you can design training around each category of believer. Because one type of training doesn't always fit all. For example, a mature believer might be bored by some of the very simple and basic concepts of Christianity. And likewise, a new believer might be overwhelmed if you start talking about Revelation. So what you want to do in this exercise is get people thinking about what would they teach people in these different categories or levels of their faith. And again, you can allow about 15 minutes for this, or sometimes you can just have them take the exercise home and do it at night.